I think when it comes to understanding the issue of security between Israelis and Palestinians, the central question is the security of whom and from what. And I think that this important context will help us understand a lot about the key questions around security that are being discussed today by Israelis, Palestinians, and American officials. We are talking about a context in which there is no security for Palestinians under any situation. A context of military occupation where Palestinians are ruled by an Israeli military and an Israeli government which they have no say in. This is a fundamental lack of security, and it's also a context in which Palestinians are asked and in fact demanded to provide security for the very people who are occupying them. In this context, security for Palestinians is non-existent, while security for Israelis becomes the central demand and focus of everyone involved. According to the United Nations, the year 2022, the previous year, was the single deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank in almost 2 decades. This year, 2023, started off on an even faster pace when it comes to the killing of Palestinians by the Israeli military in the West Bank. Nearly 30 Palestinians were killed in the first few weeks of 2023, putting the Israeli military on pace to more than double the record year when it comes to killings of Palestinians from 2022. This is the situation that we see today, with increased Israeli military raids into Palestinian towns and cities and refugee camps, with what seems to be loosened regulations around the use of lethal force by the Israeli military, and the killings, not just of Palestinians involved in resistance, but also innocent civilians in what has become all too frequent Israeli military operations in civilian spaces. For the better part of the last 3 decades, Israeli politics has been moving further and further to the right. The latest iteration of the Israeli government is the most right-wing and indeed fascist version of an Israeli government that we have seen in years. There used to be a time when right-wing activists in Israeli society would petition the government to accelerate demolitions in Palestinian areas like Area C of the West Bank, to advance settlement expansion, and so on. Today, those activists who used to be petitioning the government are the government and are in charge of these very policies. It's become so extreme that the new Minister of National Security was once considered so extreme and so dangerous that he wasn't even allowed to be enlisted in the Israeli military. This is now a person who's in charge of Israeli law enforcement and police. So it is within the broader context of increased violence on Palestinians that this new extremist government now takes the reins of power. The arsonists are essentially running the fire station, and they have very few restraints on them from anywhere else. When the United States helped broker what became known as the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, and particularly the signings of the Camp David peace accords in the 1990s, a centerpiece of that process was this idea of security coordination, that the Palestinians would play a role in assisting the Israeli military occupation in providing security, maintaining security, not for Palestinians, but for Israelis. As the American-led peace process has fallen apart over these years. And as other elements of that Oslo peace process, including most importantly, an end to Israeli settlement expansion and the development of an independent, viable Palestinian state, as those things have fallen by the wayside and become relics, one of the few lasting cornerstones that continues to be a central demand of the Israelis and the Americans today is this continued security coordination. And the Palestinian Authority, while it was supposed to be a temporary entity that was supposed to carry Palestinians into statehood by, at the time, 1999, it is today, over 20 years later, reduced to a limited administrative body whose main purpose is to provide security for the Israeli military occupation. This, of course, has created tremendous problems for Palestinians who have looked to their leadership not to provide security for Israelis, but to find a way to provide security and independence and freedom for Palestinians. For years, Palestinians have demanded an end to security coordination by the Palestinian Authority, but this has been routinely overruled by the highest levels of the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas in particular, precisely because of how important this element has been to the U.S.-Palestinian relationship and the U.S.-Israel relationship. In recent years, with the increased violence of the Israeli military occupation targeting Palestinians, this has become harder and harder to sustain. One of the implications of the long-standing failure of the American-led peace process is a demand by many people, many Palestinians in particular, to find a new vision, a new way forward. As the old answers have clearly failed, there are demands to come up with new strategies, new paths forward, new approaches to Palestinian liberation and their struggle for freedom. The Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization have long been hesitant to go down this road. And while there has been a recognition, I think, on the part of the PLO that the strategy of sort of US-led peacemaking has failed, and this is evidenced by the fact that the PLO has opted, for example, for a strategy of internationalization, through applying for statehood, for example, through international institutions, and perhaps even seeking some form of redress of grievances through international legal bodies like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, for example. This has largely been done within the framework of a two-state solution, within the framework of partition, and importantly within the framework of international law, at which UN Resolution 242, of course, remains at the center. In many ways, the directions that we are starting to see Palestinians go today is a product of the fact that the United States and Israel have conceptualized a two-state solution in a very particular way. That is, a solution to an Israeli problem and not a Palestinian one. That problem being that Israel seeks to be a quote-unquote Jewish and democratic state while it is unable to figure out how to end a long-standing military occupation of millions of non-Jews who have no right to vote. A two-state solution might have been some sort of answer to that particular problem, but for Palestinians, their problem, of course, is much larger. And a cornerstone of that approach, one that puts the security of Israelis ahead of the security of Palestinians, has proven to be a failure and is part, I believe, of what Palestinians continue to reject today. All of this has pointed Palestinians in a new direction of looking beyond these failed approaches to something new. Where it goes from here is not yet clear, but what everyone can conclude is that the previous approaches are certainly not an answer.